back at it with part 2. So continuing on, we're on to our next ecological zone, which is the lower montane forest. Montane just meaning mountain. So the lower part of the mountain. So the most prevalent zone in the Sierra Nevadas is this lower montane forest. This is the majority of the Sierra Nevada ecoregion. You get the same Mediterranean climate that we're used to talking about, the warm and dry summers, the cool winters, and then we've talked about the idea that most of the precipitation happens during those winters. And when we say precip, we're talking about rain and snow. This is the first continuous zone of conifers. You do get some ponderosas, and we talked about those foothill pines down in the oak woodlands, but the majority of conifers and that conifer diversity, that when you hear people say the words mixed conifer, this is the area that they're talking about. Greatest diversity of coniferous trees in the world. You get ponderosa pines, Jeffrey pines, sugar pines, incense cedars, white fir, Douglas fir, giant sequoia are kind of your main species in this area, and all of them have fire-resistant characteristics. So they are used to fire, they want fire, they're all about fire because they have been adapted to fire. Also in this area, you've got hardwood trees, shrubs, herbs, grasses, vines. They all can sprout, meaning they all have definitely adapted to frequent and more than likely low-intensity fire because of the trees making sure that they get up above the fire, and then so that way all this other stuff can burn off, and all this other stuff is okay with burning off because it can all sprout right back, and it all is very fine. So the hardwood trees, the shrubs, the herbs, the grasses, the vine, they're all fire enhanced. They are all saying fire's great, let's do it, because they are enhanced by fire. They don't get less in number because of fire. They are enhanced. They want fire. So just some ideas of what this looks like, painting that picture of different coniferous trees, and the idea of what this looks like, getting the mixture of firs and sequoias and cedars and all ponderosa pine, all of these different trees that you can find in the Sierra Nevadas. So, in terms of fire, most fire occurs between midsummer and early fall in the Sierras. Although what was considered in the past out of season fires, which are now just basically late season fires or early season fires, because the season has, as we've talked about, increased so much as the climate's warming that it's just now it's a part of the season. But back before, that would be out of the season if there's something burning in October or something burning in May. But now it's kind of the season's just been extended. It's definitely frequent fire historically. That frequent fire led to structural diversity at both stand levels, so just in certain pockets or certain places, but then also landscape level. We see that, and we see a direct effect of topography in terms of our looking at the fire regime and fire history, because topography is definitely going to influence the way fire burns. We've got a lot of topography in Sierra Nevada, so we're going to have places that are going to get burnt up if the fire can get a run up a hill or up a canyon, whereas other places where it's flat or the fields become sparse, we won't get as much of a run, so we're going to end up with these mosaics of burns no matter what. In terms of our fire, we also have in our drier areas, we get longer fire seasons, and those places experience the most fire. Those parts are usually, you'll see California black oak or ponderosa pine as our dominant species in those areas because they're well adapted to fire. The cooler, wetter sites, they are going to get less frequent fire. Those are going to be dominated by Douglas fir. And then that also is going to play into aspect as well, that on your south and western slopes, more ponderosa pine, your north and eastern slopes, more Douglas fir. Just kind of playing into that whole idea of how all of these species kind of adapt to their surroundings. And so just really want to focus on this idea of how can we tell these forests are adapted to fire. And I really want you to just look at these 4 pictures here and just think about fire and a fire coming through. Does it make sense that that a fire would want to come through and climb up these trees and then burn the trees and moonscape all of this stuff? Or when you just look at this picture, do you say, oh, it makes sense that the fire would just kind of creep along the ground. It wouldn't get very high. Maybe it takes off a few branches at the bottom, but mostly just burns everything out so that we get these nice open areas. And we see it in the species adaptations when we think about especially species like Jeffrey pine and species like ponderosa pine, where they even when they're younger, they have thick bark, so they're ready to survive fire. They have thick bark. They self-prune. They also drop a lot of litter, and that's important because you can see in some of these places the herbaceous layer is not very contiguous. So there's got to be something that would allow the fire to continue. So they drop a lot of litter on the ground so that way the fire can continue. But litter is something that's going to burn up fast. You know, when we're saying litter, we're talking about pine needles and small branches, that sort of thing. That stuff's not going to burn very long. So it's not going to be something that's going to carry fire a long ways. It's just going to allow fire to just kind of move through. So low intensity, frequent fires just make sense for this area. And that ties into this idea, the most productive fire-prone forests in the western U.S. These forests understand that they need to produce. So they're going to produce lots of trees, they're going to produce lots of seed, they're going to produce lots of litter, because they want fire. Now, however, the problem is then if you take away that frequent fire and we just let litter layer after 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 litter layer build up, and then instead of maybe having, trees spread out like this, now let's double the trees, or let's triple the trees, or let's quadruple the amount of trees. That changes everything. That changes the game, and that changes that whole regime, because now it's not going to be little frequent fires, because maybe now we don't have enough light to let the grass layers grow. Now we have this big buildup of litter to where maybe it's going to sit underneath the trees. And we talked about that idea of cooking the trees, where you get that severity where the fire just has that long residence time and sits there and cooks the roots and kind of gets into the cambium from underneath, because it just keeps burning through the litter. And we have so many trees that they're all connected, and now we could see a stand replacing event. But this is what people think of when they think of the Sierra Nevadas. This is what historically was described to us when people talk about walking through these the giant trees and having these big open spaces and being able to see through the forest. That's the idea. That's what people think about, and that shows us what kind of fire makes sense for these areas. But when you look at the forest now and you see the amount of bark beetle kill, and you see the amount of trees, and you see what these areas look like underneath, it's not adapted to high or to low intensity frequent fire. It's just not. And it's going to take more than just me saying, well, we need to go in there and burn it. You got to do some thinnings. You got to do some burning. You got to do different types of burning too, because you can't go in there and just blaze it, because it's going to be just as bad as a wildfire. There's a lot of work that needs to be put in these forests if we want to make them back to this free low intensity high frequency fire regime. Or there's also another alternative, which is like the creek fire, where it's, well, here comes the high intensity fire, and then we'll just get a reset. But some of us may not get to enjoy those forests for the next 50 years or so. And it's a tough call, but I mean, it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to take a lot of manpower, but it depends on, if we really appreciate the Sierra Nevada bioregion for the unique kind of one-of-a-kind place that it is. So let's continue on in our regions. Now we go to the upper montane forest. So we go up. A lot of the trees that I'm talking about you can find around 6,000 to 8,000 feet, but the region or the ecological zone technically goes from 2,500 feet to 11,500 feet. This area receives heavy snowfall. Where they decide these are lower montane forests versus upper montane forests is the line, is they go off of the precipitation. So where more than 50% of the precipitation is just snow, that is what they consider to be upper montane forest. Whereas if it's less than 50% of the precipitation is snow, that's the lower montane forest. So this area usually gets impacted by snow, lots of heavy snowfall in the winter. These are deep rocky soils, and once again we talked about in the north they're more volcanic in origin, whereas down in the south they're more granitic. So if you want to see that difference, go to Yosemite National Park and see those big huge slabs of granite sticking out the ground like El Cap. And if you want to see the volcanic part, go up to Lassen National Park in northeastern California, and you'll see it is a much different look to it. But you still get large expanses of exposed rock. The upper montane forest, like I mentioned earlier, will occur on both sides of the crest, so the west and the east side of the Sierra Nevadas. And the species that you'll see in this area, California red fir, western white pine, Jeffrey pine, quaking aspen is a hardwood tree that you'll see here, and Sierra juniper, a smaller conifer tree. So these are these are a look at that upper montane forest, and mostly dominated by California red fir, which is this guy right here, and this guy right here. And one of the things that's really characteristic of the upper montane forest is, one, it just looks like this area is ready to get bombarded by snow. In my mind, because of you don't see like huge patches of grass and all that stuff, because it ends up being just snow covered for a lot of the time. But then also these large expanses of just exposed rock everywhere, just exposed rock sticking out all over the place. That's kind of characteristic of this upper montane forest. So, in terms of the upper montane forest, many species have fire-resistant characteristics, and they do respond favorably to fire. So the shrubs and the hardwood trees sprout. The conifers have thick bark when they're older, and that's interesting, because you got this area. You'll get Jeffrey pine, but you'll also get California red fir. So California red fir is one of those species that, when it's younger, it does not have thick bark. It does not respond favorably to fire. It's basically saying, when I'm younger, it's okay. You can wipe me out. If there's fire, you can wipe me out. But if there's no fire and I get established, then I'm going to stick around here for a while. Whereas Jeffrey pine is all about fire, whether it's young, whether it's old. Jeffrey pine is adapted to surviving fire. Quaking aspen is our primary hardwood species, and it is a vigorous and profuse sprouter. And the idea that there's not as much quaking aspen now as there used to be, that decline in the species is definitely seems to be attributed to a lack of fire, because it's such a vigorous and profuse sprouter with fire that you would just imagine it'd be everywhere, and it would be gaining in size and area, but it's decreasing in size and area, which tells us that it's lacking what it needs in order to sprout, which is that disturbance. And the understory of these upper montane forests is filled with species that are top killed by fire and will sprout back easily. So it does have fire resistant characteristics. It does respond favorably to fire, and it's got an easy ignition source because this part of the forest gets a high number of lightning strikes, but it usually gets those lightning strikes with rain. And then California red fir really produces compact field beds. So it does produce. It is a productive species, coniferous species, in terms of producing a lot of litter. But it's compact. It's small. It's tightly compacted. So it doesn't really. It's not really good for fire spread. So what does that mean? That means fire doesn't burn? No, fire will burn because we have the ignitions. We will at some parts of the year not have it be snow covered and all of that. But usually they're low intensity, slow spreading fires that don't really go anywhere unless you get extreme weather conditions. So much different from the foothills where we would get fires that could spread easily because we got the herbaceous layers or we got the chaparral layers. And then the lower montane forest where we should get these high frequency, low intensity fires. But of course we talked about how that regime is changing. To then the upper montane forest where it's still low intensity but slow spreading fires that just kind of creep around and burn where they can and don't really go anywhere. They're never of great size, the fires up in this forest. Up above that, so let's go up to like 8,000, 11,000 feet just below timberline, we get the subalpine forest. You get an extensive band of subalpine forest on the west side and a thin band on the east side because, like we said, we've got that escarpment where we really start just going downhill quickly on the east side. The wind is harsh, as you can see by the form of this tree here. Solar radiation is pretty intense, and this area is definitely covered in frost and snow. The snow-free period is very short at the subalpine level. Your soils are shallow with a minimum water holding capacity, so you got really poorly developed soils. So the species in the central and central and southern part of the Sierras, lodgepole pine is going to be your more dominant species. Lodgepole pine here in the Sierras is different than lodgepole pine in the interior west in that you don't really get serotinous cones on the lodgepole pine here. So they're not set up for that, like every tree grows exactly the same. We want a stand replacing fire to come so that all the cones open up and drop the seed. The lodgepole pine here more, it's more just perennial where it'll hold the seed for a bunch of years and then eventually let it go. And so it's more of still a prolific cedar, but it doesn't need that stand replacing event to get the cones open. In the northern part of the Sierras, more in the like north of Tahoe, you get more mountain hemlock being the dominant species. Your other species, white bark pine, which is a little bit of a favorite of mine that we'll talk about, western white pine, limber pine, and foxtail pine, which is also just some interesting different pine species. So here's just another look of the subalpine forest with those glacial lakes. And just, you can get some patches. You definitely get the rocky outcrops. Just some patches here, and then it can get sparse like the picture I was showing before. So, in terms of fire, trees are easily killed at a young age, but increase resistance as they grow older. So similar to the upper montane forest, similar to that idea of California red fir, all the trees here in the subalpine forest, they will develop fire resistance as they grow older, but the younger ones do not have good fire resistance. The lodgepole pine sometimes needs seeding from off-site to recolonize an area. It can't just do it itself sometimes. In the north, mountain hemlocks are are susceptible to fire due to thin bark, low-hanging branches, dense groups, and flammable foliage. White bark pine is a tree that grows not really in big dense thickets. It grows scattered in areas of patchy fields. And so it's interesting to think about, well, wait a minute, how does this tree survive if it ends up, it's just one's over here and two are over there, and it's all scattered in patchy fields. And it survives because of the Clark's Nutcracker. Clark's Nutcracker is this bird right here on the right, and this is a white bark pine, as you can see by the bark on this pine tree that it is sitting on. And what this bird does is this bird likes eating the seeds from the white bark pine. But more importantly, what it does is it likes to take the seeds and it likes to bury the seeds in the ground in the surrounding area so that it has little storages for the winter. And because of that, that's how the seed of the white bark pine actually gets spread. And I just think that that's a really cool way of kind of mutualism, where the tree is helping the bird and the bird is helping the tree. In the Subalpine forest, ignitions are infrequent. They just do not happen all that much. And lodgepole pine will dominate after a fire due to prolific seeding. So if you want more information about the Clark's Nutcracker, which I think it's a pretty cool species in how it helps the white bark pine, go ahead and pause and go to the notes and click on this link for it's an article in All About Birds that really explains a project that is studying the Clark's Nutcracker and how it all works. But then also just here is the idea of white bark pine. And the idea that white bark pine is a keystone species in the high mountain ecosystems because it produces that large nutritious seed that's held in the cones. Bears eat them, squirrels eat them. The Clark's Nutcracker, of course, buries them in its caches to retrieve them later. And the seedlings, it says right down here in the bottom right, are almost exclusively from the unretrieved seed caches of the Clark's Nutcracker. So this species is so important and integral to these other species, but this keystone species also relies on the Clark's Nutcracker, which makes the Clark's Nutcracker a keystone species. And so it's just really an interesting life cycle and an interesting pine tree. But this tree is also suffering from the mountain pine beetle outbreaks. It's suffering from white pine blister rust, which is a fungus from Eurasia, and it's losing out to competition from fir and spruce trees in certain areas, not specifically in the Sierra Nevadas, but you can see that it's quite a large region, and there's other places where it's kind of getting encroached on by other trees. Our next ecological zone is one that we won't spend too much time on because it's alpine meadows and shrublands. And so we're way up high here in terms of alpine meadows and shrublands. This consists of alpine fell fields and riparian areas with willow trees. Really short growing season, little biomass. Fuels, as you can see in this meadow, are very sparse. Not really much to say in terms of fire activity or fire history or fire regimes, but it's part of this bioregion. It's another ecological zone. So wanted to make sure to mention it, but not so much to talk about in terms of fire ecology for alpine meadows and shrublands. If you're not sure what I mean when I say a fell field, it's this idea of just like these shrubs, or really more herbs, forbs, growing up through the rock outcroppings that you can see here. That's what they would call an alpine fell field, and it can be large expanses or small expanses of it. that takes us to our last of the ecological zones, our sixth ecological zone, the east side forest and woodland. So this area is often transitional between the upper montane forest and then lower elevation Great Basin species, because because we go into high desert once you get off of the Sierras and start going east. So we really we've got some subalpine, we've got upper montane, and then we really kind of transition into lower elevation Great Basin with a little bit of mixture of different things in between there. So you end up with this mosaic of open woodlands, forests, shrublands, and grasslands. So like, what can you expect on the east side? You can get Jeffrey pine and ponderosa pine woodlands, right? So woodlands, where they're scattered, not really so much of a forest. You can get some quaking aspen groves. You can get some mixed white fir and pine forests. And so you get this really different mixture of areas that have fire-enhanced species and areas that have fire-inhibited species. So specifically, you can have you can have a Jeffrey pine woodland where Jeffrey pine loves fire, is all about fire. And then you can have a pinyon pine woodland where pinyon pines, they love fire, but it's kind of in a different way. Like, pinyon pine has no protection against fire. Pinyon pines just get burned up and are easily burned in fire. But they're kind of used to that, I would say. Much more so for the interior west, Arizona, New Mexico. You get areas of pinyon pine where they expect to get burned up in fire, but pinyon pine in the Sierra Nevadas does not have any fire-resistant characteristics at all. In this area, most frequent fires and low-intensity fires occur at the lower elevations, because in those upper elevations, a lot of snow cover, a lot of cold weather, not a lot of time where the climate is right for a fire. And then the fire regime has a great variety of severity. Well, what do you mean by having a great variety of severity? Well, you've got this variable mosaic of woodlands and forests and shrublands and grasslands with all these different kinds of species, and sometimes you can get sparse vegetation. So in terms of your fire regime, it's kind of all over the place, because it really just depends on the specific area within this ecological zone and what you have, because it's so variable and there's so many different things going on. And that is our 6 ecological zones. And so I kind of want to just close off this talk on the Sierra Nevadas, which I think we could probably do a whole class on the Sierra Nevadas, but I just kind of summarized what we had in the book. But there's so much more in depth we could talk about. But the book brings up 5 major management issues to really focus on: the idea of urbanization, and the idea more and more people are living up in these mountains and in these mountain communities. The idea of fire and fuels management, which we've gotten a lot into, and this picture here on the right is actually me with some people from the University of California Cooperative Extension doing a burn on some Southern California Edison lands up near Shaver Lake, and doing a prescribed burn that actually held up really well with the creek, because we got this done before the creek fire came and burned through. So feels nice to have participated on something like that, and been able to do something that helps point people to say, hey, look at how this land looks as opposed to this other land that didn't have prescribed burning happening on it. And it's hopefully that will help lead to changes in the future. Climate change, certainly that extension of fire season really can prove problematic for some of these unique areas of the Sierra Nevadas. Species at risk, when you have species adapted to specific fire regimes, if you change that fire regime, much like with the wildlife when we say, oh, well, if we have a fire come through and the fire burns it down, the wildlife's got to move on to some other area, or they've got to figure out something else to eat, or they've got to go into competition with this other species. Well, it's the same thing when we talk about these species of trees or shrubs that are adapted to fire. If you take away the fire, that species has to figure out another way to reproduce, or it has to figure out another way to fend for itself. And some of these species might disappear versus the idea of it always looking the same way that we're used to. And then air quality. And air quality is going to be problematic when you have these big, huge, high-intensity stand-replacing fires. Low-intensity fires, yeah, you might have a day where it gets smoked in because you've got a lot of canyons and valleys and other places where the smoke could settle for a night or so, maybe a couple nights. But then it'll dissipate and it'll be gone with low-intensity fires. And, having that happen a few days a year, maybe not so bad, as opposed to the idea of these big high-intensity fires where we spend all summer with this gray haze hanging around. It's a big issue. It's hazardous to our health. It's hazardous to the environment as well, and something that can be something that doesn't have to be as much of a problem, especially with the other air quality problems that we're creating as well. And I just thought I'd just leave you kind of with just a view of the Sierras that I just enjoy and I think of, and it's a wonderful place. It's a unique place. It's one of a kind in the world, and I really think we should just appreciate it for what it is and what it provides for us.